What's up creators, I hope you're all doing well. I'm Tony Fuentes, welcome back to my channel. If you don't know who I am, I post tutorials on video, photo editing, some vlogs sometimes, and in this case we're talking about gear. So if you like those type of things, check out my content down below and maybe you can subscribe with the button down here. Okay, today we're answering one of the questions that gets most asked in my Spanish channel, but also in this one, which is the typical which lens to buy. Now it's a very generic question, so we're going to break it down into two parts. In this video, we're going to cover which lens I would recommend for video, and then in another video in the future, we're going to recommend my photo suggestions for which lens to buy. Now, this question generally comes up for people who are just starting out in videography, photography, or who just bought their first camera and they don't know which lens to buy because there's a lot of them. It's very confusing because they're third-party lenses, they're prime lenses, zoom lenses, telephoto lenses. There's so many types of lenses and it could be overwhelming. Now, in this video, I'm going to give you my honest opinion in which lens you should buy. So we're going to structure it this way. First of all, we're going to talk about what kind of lens you need for video, or in my opinion, and then we're going to jump into my suggestions for full frame and also for APS-C. Now, the suggestions part is going to be only for Sony cameras because I'm a Sony user. I haven't tried any Canon, Nikon, or Panasonic lenses, so I'm just going to center in my suggestions for Sony users. So if you want to skip that part, you can skip it. But in this case, I'm just going to give you, first of all, what we're looking for in a lens for video. Okay, starting out for video, what we need is a wide angle lens in my opinion. Now, why I'm talking about wide angle, I'm talking about maybe a 16mm to a 35mm, that range, because that range will allow you to capture all the context on the surroundings around your subject. If you look at modern day movies or even the series that we see on streaming softwares, what we're looking at is that mostly 75 or 80% of the shot of a single episode is shot with a wide angle lens. Why? Because the director, the cinematographer, the ones who's behind the camera is interested in showing the surroundings and telling a story. There's no point in having all your images or all your clips with a telephoto lens where you can only see the expressions on the face. I don't know where the subject is. He could be in the Alps, he could be in Africa, he could be in my basement down below. You wouldn't even notice the surroundings if you're always using a telephoto lens. That's why creators, that's why cinematographers, that's why filmmakers always use wide angle lenses. And the preferred lenses that they use is normally a focal distance between the 16, 24, or even 35mm. So that's the range that we want. Now, again, another thing that we're looking for is a lens that is versatile. You're just starting out in videography and filmmaking, so you need a lens that can get you through different situations. So for that, we want a lens that is a zoom lens that has a wide range of focal distances. Now, the typical lens that we can find in that range is the 16 to 35, which is a great range to have. At 16, you can capture basically all your surroundings in a very wide field of view. And then at 35, you can zoom in to capture some details, maybe on the expressions, maybe on actions that they're doing with the hands. It's a very versatile focal distance. So that's what we're looking for. So just as an example, let's look at this clip of Lord of the Rings, and here we can see the Fellowship arriving at Rohan, and immediately we can see that they're using a wide angle lens. Why? Because we can see all the context around the three main subjects. So it's a very small subject in comparison to the field of view that we're getting. Then they cut into maybe a 35 or 50mm to make emphasis on the face and when they're talking, and then even a telephoto. So the telephoto and the mid-standard zoom ranges are used just to make some emphasis on subjects when they're talking, maybe when they're doing something specific, but normally the story goes with a wide angle lens. Now, there's a lot of lenses that cover that wide angle zoom range, but in particular, I'm looking for the 2.8 apertures or the faster apertures. Now, if you don't know what aperture is, it's basically the amount of light that your lens is letting in into your sensor. Now, the better aperture or the fastest aperture that your lens has, the more light is entering into your sensor, and therefore you can shoot in darker conditions. Now, what we're looking for is the fastest aperture that we can get in maybe a zoom lens, which is 2.8 aperture at the moment. So having said that, what we want is a very wide lens with a versatile focal distance from 16 to 35 maybe. Then we want it to be in with a fast aperture. So maybe you didn't understand the word that I said right now, but that's okay, guys. In the future, when you get more accustomed to these terms, you'll understand all these values. Now, what we're looking for as a little breakdown is a wide angle lens with a very versatile zoom range, and also we want it to have a fast aperture. So those are the three main things that we're looking for in our lens. So let's jump into my suggestions for full frame and then for APS-C. Okay, so here we are in B&H Photo, which is a great site to use for comparison, and we have four lenses over here. all these are full frame. And as a base, we have the Sony FE 16-35 G Master 2.8, which is an outstanding lens. This is the one that if you have the money, I would recommend to get, because at 16 you can get the complete field of view. You can even vlog with it if that's something that you're into, or you can capture the entirety of the landscape. And then you can zoom in maybe at 20, at 24 to have more cinematic shots. And even at 35, you can capture some details with a more cropped in image. So it's a fantastic focal distance. But the problem is that it's $2,200. That's an immense amount of money. It's a lot of money for me, and maybe for you guys as well, it's a lot of money. But if you can buy it, go ahead. So we want something in the similar range. Now, next we have a Sigma 14-24 2.8, which is a great lens, but I'm gonna discard it right now just because you can screw on filters on the front of it. Now, if you want to capture good exposed image, you need ND filters or neutral density filters in front of your lens, or at the back, or maybe digital ND filters. But you need to control your aperture in that way. Now, this lens has a spherical glass in front of it, which impedes it from using ND filters on front. So I'm just gonna discard it immediately, and we're left with my two main suggestions. First of all, the 16-28 from Sigma, 2.8 aperture, which is very good, contemporary lens. Now, this lens is fantastic. Now, 16-28 isn't quite as wide as 16-35. It's a bit more cropped in. You can't go zoom in too much, but still it's a good option, in particular because of the price. Look at the price. It's not even half of the price of the Sony G Master, which is very accessible, and I would consider it to be a good viable option. Now, the other option is the Tamron 17-28 2.8 aperture, and this lens again comes around at the same price. It just has the 17-28, so it's not as wide as the 16, just by a millimeter, and it doesn't zoom in as much as the Sony. And this is the exact one that I have over here that I use all the time for my vlogging and for my landscape shots. This is basically my go-to for wide angle shots for filmmaking. Now, price, as we know, is one of the biggest factors when it comes to selecting a lens. But one thing that's a bit more important is the image quality. So let's look at the MTF charts of these three lenses. Now, here in the Sony page, we can find the MTF chart of the 16-35. Now, if you don't know what an MTF chart is, it's basically a way to measure or to know the quality of the image of a lens from sharpness and contrast. Now, these tests are done previously before the lens is released, so people can expect what kind of image quality you can get out of this lens. Now, this is the Sony website, and as you can see, we have a very low quality MTF chart, but we're looking at these two. Now, if you want an in-depth tutorial on MTF charts and how to read them, I'll link up a video up here that I made, so you can dominate this and make sure you're selecting the right lens for you. Now, here we have the 16 millimeters at maximum aperture at 2.8 and 35 at 2.8. The f8 we're not gonna pay attention because, well, image quality should be a lot better at f8. But over here at 16 mil, we can see that the contrast, which is the red line, is almost perfect at 16 mil. It just drops a bit to the high 90s over here. And contrast also at 35 is also fantastic. Now, where it does falter just a bit is sharpness. As we can see at the edges of the sensor, it does falter just a bit, but still, this is the high standard for a wide angle zoom lens that we can get for Sony cameras. Now, let's have a look into how the other two suggestions compare in terms of image quality to the Sony. So over here in the Sony website, we have the 16-28. We're gonna go down to performance and data, and here we have the MTF chart. Now, as you can see, it's not quite as sharp and contrasty as the Sony. It is very sharp, this one, and the contrast just falters just a bit at 16, but then we can see that at 28, zooming in, the sharpness starts to drop drastically through the border of the sensor and also the contrast. So it's not the best performance, but it is a very decent performance for a wide angle lens. Wide angle lenses in particular are quite difficult to make for manufacturers because of the focal distance and the wide aperture. Then let's see the Tamron. Here we have the Tamron, and over here we have the MTF chart. And as you can see, it's very similar to the Sigma. It just has a very constant contrast over here and very constant sharpness, but at the borders, it does falter quite a bit. Little dip that we can see in the curves is quite drastic, meaning that in the borders of your image, you're not gonna get very much contrast or sharpness at 16 mil. And I have noticed it with this one, but still, it's a great lens. Now over here at 28 mil at 2.8 aperture as well, contrast remains quite nice, but then sharpness does falter quite a bit at the borders of the sensor. So you can conclude that obviously the Sony lens is the highest quality, or delivers the highest image quality. But these two, the Tamron and then the Sigma, do deliver a very nice image quality. I would consider the Tamron the worst of them. The Sigma, I think, is the best option in terms of price and image quality, but it's up to you guys to decide. Then you can go in and looking at maybe the weight, maybe the filter size, all of those things, that's specifics. But in this case, I would recommend either the Tamron or the Sigma. But of course, if you can buy the Sony, go ahead and buy the Sony. That's the best image quality that you can get, even if it's quite dated and it's quite a big lens. But the Sigma and the Tamron are not too far behind in terms of image quality, and particularly it's very appealing because of the price. Now let's jump into APS-C. Those work for full frame, and I'll give you my honest opinions or suggestions on APS-C lenses. Now, as you may have noticed, APS-C lenses are quite cheaper and quite smaller compared to the full frame brothers. Now, because of that, if you have the money, I would consider buying two lenses for APS-C, maybe a 16mm as prime, 16mm 1.4, and maybe a 24mm, which is equivalent to a 35. But if you just want one zoom lens that can do it all, here are my two suggestions and my two recommendations. Now, first of all, we have the Sony 10-20 f4. This is a brand new lens from Sony, and as you can see, it's a quite nice focal distance because 10-20 in APS-C is an equivalent to 15-30, which is a very nice focal distance for video in particular, but it is f4. Now, I have a big problem with this being f4 because in APS-C sensor bodies, there's a lot less light entering the sensor. Now, you're closing down that aperture to f4, then a lot less light comes into the sensor, and it's going to be very hard for you guys to have very nice images or correct images in low light situations. Now, my suggestion or my recommendation is this Tamron 11-20 2.8 aperture. Now, the constant 2.8 aperture is a deal breaker between these two. And as you can see, it's $100 cheaper than the Sony. So this is my recommendation. 11-20 is a 17-30 focal distance, or the equivalent, which is a fantastic range. It's not quite as 16-35, but it's 17-30, which is a very nice focal distance to capture all that you want, tell a better story, and capture some details with that focal distance. So this would be my suggestion if you want just one lens for APS-C dedicated for video. So guys, remember that these lenses that I just suggested, the Sigma 16-28, the Tamron 17-28, and the Tamron 11-20 are linked down below in case you want to check them out. And remember, this is just my suggestion, me answering that question that appears a lot in my comment section. And I would go for a zoom lens if case you can only afford or buy one lens. This is just my suggestion, a wide angle lens, a wide angle zoom lens with a fast aperture that allows you to capture everything on the go without changing lenses. So that's about it, guys. This is just my suggestion. Remember that in the future, I'll make the video for my suggestions for photo. In this case, this is going to be it for today. If you like the video, like it, subscribe, all those things. I'm Tony Fuentes. Cheers to all of you. See you in the next one.